Learning Spanish in 3 years. Well, first of all, I want to apologize for sounding a bit strange today. I'm unfortunately a little ill, but that won't stop me from recording a new podcast episode. And therefore, I just want to, welcome you to this episode. And today, as you already heard, we are going to talk about learning Spanish in 3 years. Because one thing I've been thinking about a lot recently is how unrealistic school expectations can be when it comes to learning foreign languages. For my A levels, I was required to have two foreign languages. I already had English, but that meant I had to start learning a completely new language from zero. So I had to choose between French and Spanish, and I ended up choosing Spanish. And the problem wasn't that I didn't want to learn a new language. Don't get me wrong here. I actually think learning languages is a really valuable skill. The real problem was that we were expected to learn this language in just 3 years and then take serious exams in it. And in my opinion, that's just not realistic at all. Because, like, when you start learning a new language from zero, everything is unfamiliar. The vocabulary, the grammar, the pronunciation, even how sentences are structured, of course. At the beginning, you're just trying to understand the basics and build a foundation, I guess. But in school, it felt like we were expected to move forward extremely quickly. After only about 1 year, we were already supposed to write longer texts and summarize summaries in Spanish. And even though many of us were still struggling with basic grammar and sentence structure, the difficulty of the tests increased much faster than our actual, um, I guess, ability to use the language. And that created a huge gap between what we were learning and also what we were expected to do in exams. What really showed me that the expectations were unrealistic was the fact that it wasn't just me having problems. Almost everyone in my class was struggling with Spanish. It was just a few students who didn't study enough. It felt like the majority of the class was having a hard time keeping up with the pace. And when almost an entire class is struggling with the same subject, that usually means the problem isn't the students, but the expectations placed on them. I want to point out here, this is something I find is very important to say. I do not blame the teachers for the situation. You could tell that they knew the material was moving very fast and that many of us were overwhelmed. And sometimes they would even acknowledge that the pace was intense or that the topic was difficult. They were trying to help us as much as possible, but at the end of the day, they had a curriculum they had to follow. So they could just slow down or skip topics because we still had to be prepared for the official exams, you know? So they were stuck in a difficult position here. They saw that the students were struggling, but they didn't have the power to change the system. And on top of that, we also had several teacher changes during those 3 years. And while that's something unavoidable, it made learning even more difficult, of course. You know, every teacher has a different teaching style, different explanations, and sometimes a different focus on certain topics. So, just when you started getting used to one teacher's way of teaching, you suddenly had to adapt to someone new while still trying to keep up with the language itself. And well, that constant change made it even harder to build consistency and confidence in Spanish. And something else which is really interesting, like another major issue, was the difference between what we were learning in class and what we were expected to produce in exams. We were still learning basic grammar and vocabulary, but in tests we were expected to, write structured texts, summaries, and sometimes even analyze content in Spanish. It often felt like the exams were designed for students who had been learning the language for much longer than we actually had. And in real life, learning a language takes years of consistent exposure. You need to hear it regularly use it in conversations, read it, and make mistakes while speaking. That's how fluency develops over time, you know? But in school, we only had a few hours of Spanish lessons per week, of course. Outside of school, most of us didn't use the language at all. So it was very difficult to reach the level of comfort and confidence that the exams seemed to expect from us, you know? And what made this even more obvious to me was comparing Spanish to English. I've been learning English for many years, and I was constantly exposed to it through games, videos, and the internet in general. That made it much easier, to improve naturally over time. With Spanish, that exposure simply did not exist. Like the language was basically limited to the classroom and the homework, of course. So expecting the same level of performance in just 3 years felt disconnected from how language learning actually works. And another thing that made the situation even more stressful was the fact that Spanish wasn't the only subject we had to focus on, of course. Like, I was doing my A levels here. At the same time, we were preparing for exams in math, science, and all other subjects required for A levels. And so we had to divide our time and energy between many different topics while still being expected to master a completely new language in a very short time. And that made it feel overwhelming and sometimes even frustrating. But looking back, it didn't feel like the teachers were failing us. Like, it really felt like the system was putting both students and teachers in an impossible situation. Students were expected to reach a high level in a short time, and teachers were, well, expected to deliver that level of progress, even though they knew the pace was too fast for many of us. And I still believe that learning a second or third language is extremely valuable, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to at least learn the basics of Spanish, but I do think the way it's taught and tested in school doesn't always match the reality of people who actually learn languages. And 3 years might be enough to understand basic conversations and grammar, but expecting students to write complex texts and pass serious exams in that time feels very unrealistic and necessarily stressful. And at the end of the time, I was writing bad grades, like really, really bad grades. And I was just surviving because of my, when you raise your hand in school and then when the teacher asks something and then you raise your hand and answer it, I forgot the word for it in English. I did that a lot, so this is the only reason why I survived this time without any really bad grades. And at the end of the day, I chose to work with Duolingo. I bet many of you have heard of it before, and that's just the way I learned uh Spanish. And yeah, that's how I managed to get my grades up again eventually. But yeah, that's just my experience of having to learn Spanish in a very short time for my A levels. I'd be really interested to know if other students had similar experiences with learning a new language at school. So maybe write it in the comments if you have experience with this. And yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. This has been Jax, and make sure to subscribe if you want to know what's next.